ministry tend to focus on the 20th century, with generally only occasional mentions of any earlier attempts when it comes to congregations. In this presentation today, however, I will be focusing on the earliest attempt at founding a Spanish-speaking church community, Iglesia de Santiago, a Spanish-speaking church in New York that existed between 1866 and 1893. As a form of shorthand, I will refer to it as Santiago while speaking, so that I don't have to keep saying Iglesia de Santiago. So, some context. But a note before I begin, actually. All of this work stems from research I conducted for my master's thesis, which relied on digitized newspapers from the United States and genealogical records. There are parts of this story I know I am missing. At times, I will note places where I'm making educated conjectures, which I hope to do more research on in the future. Now, before delving into Santiago itself, let me first address the context of its founding. New York was home to a sizable transnational Cuban community in the mid-19th century, largely due to the thriving sugar and cigar trades. Members of this community were comfortable in both New York and Cuba, largely due to the strong economic ties between the two places. Throughout the 19th century, Cuba had developed a monoculture economy based on sugar and the labor of enslaved people, fueled by New York's merchants and counting houses. Yet while Cuba had remained under Spanish control during the early 19th century, a growing movement emerged towards increasing political self-determination within the Spanish system. However, the Spanish government refused to give any such leeway, especially as it came to religion. Spain's explicit association of Catholicism with Spanishness, Españolismo, cast any Cuban who challenged the political system as religiously suspect. Therefore, by the mid-19th century, New York was home to both those who consistently moved back between the two locations, as well as to a growing number of political exiles who were disenchanted with the Catholic Church. When the General Convention received a proposal from the Bishop White Prayer Book Society in Philadelphia for a Spanish prayer book translation in 1853, the Society could not help but highlight how their observations demonstrated that Cubans would warmly receive a Spanish Book of Common Prayer. After a few years of no action on the subject, the New York Common Prayer and Bible Society took over the project. They turned to the Reverend Dr. Francis L. Hawks, the first conservator of the Episcopal Church, to supervise the project, as he spoke Spanish. While two versions were completed by 1863, that same year, the Episcopal Diocese of New York ordained the Reverend Angel Herreros de Mora, a former Catholic priest from Spain, who at the time worked for the American Bible Society, revising the Reina Valera translation that comes out in 1865. With a priest and a prayer book, a Spanish-speaking congregation began meeting in the chapel of New York University sometime before April 2nd, 1866, when the congregation formally incorporated and elected 2 wardens and 8 vestry members. The congregation at this time numbered approximately 20 former Catholics from Spain, Cuba, and Mexico, along with their families. The leadership was overwhelmingly Cuban. Of the 10 officials elected that day, 8 were born in Cuba and 1 was married to a Cuban. The Reverend Herreros de Mora served as rector, and with the assistance of the Reverend Dr. Hawks, until Hawks' death in September of 1866. Within a few months of Santiago's founding, Trinity Church extended the use of Trinity Chapel to the congregation in the evenings. It is now the Sorbian Cathedral of St. Stapa. If some of you are aware, it burned down. It had a very terrible fire in 2016 and nearly burned to the ground. So, sad story, but I feel like I always must mention it whenever I talk about Trinity Chapel. So the congregation began meeting there. By the beginning of 1867, however, the Reverend Herreros de Mora left New York for good. He had had a religious call to attend to the needs of Spanish-speaking Protestants on the Iberian Peninsula. Without any recorded support, literally, he showed up in Lisbon to the chaplain being like, I'm here. He founded the Iglesia Evangelica Española, which would ultimately merge with another church to form the Lusitanian Catholic Apostolic Evangelical Church, Portugal's oldest Protestant denomination and part of the Anglican Communion. Back in New York, Santiago's rectorship passed to Henry Chauncey Riley. A Chilean-born priest from a family of native New Yorkers involved in trade. Riley worked to publicize the church and negotiated another move, this time to the Église de Saint-Esprit, New York's lone non-English speaking Episcopal parish. The move enabled them to move their services to the morning, and so Santiago began holding services there starting September 22nd, 1867. The community was fluid, moving often between New York and their home countries. Riley's passion for working in Spain, Mexico, and South America became a frequent focus of Santiago's public work, which he highlighted to any missionary convention that would listen. Riley began training community members for the ministry to help convert Spanish speakers. One of these men was Joaquín de Palma, a Cuban merchant and lawyer who was in political exile from Cuba. He was more overtly political than Riley. At his first public speech in November of 1868, he called for the community to thank God for the revolution in Spain's government that gave Protestants the ability to spread their religion. While the revolutions in Spain's government opened the door for Protestantism in other parts of the Spanish-speaking world, the revolution in Cuba would become Santiago's focus. In October 1868, an uprising began in eastern Cuba, demanding a long list of civil rights, including religious toleration and the abolition of slavery. The resulting fighting, known as the 10 Years' War, caused thousands of people to leave the country, fleeing economic ruin, physical violence, seizure of assets, exile, and death. Many headed to the pre-existing Cuban community in New York, but exile communities also appeared in other areas, such as Florida and Jamaica. In New York, while there was a Spanish-speaking Episcopal church awaiting these exiles, there was temporarily no priest. Riley had left for Mexico in late December of 1868, a journey that would, as we have heard, would ultimately lead to his election as bishop and then his stripping of his episcopate. His successor was Joaquín de Palma, who was ordained on September 26, 1861. At the ordination service, the Reverend Dr. William Morgan told Palma, "I hope that what you have done in this humble field of duty would carry an extended influence with it throughout your native isle and help raise it from the depths of universal darkness from which it has now been plunged." Paternalistic, but also very interesting because this is literally as many Cubans are fleeing to New York. And therefore, and because of the business connections, a lot of people knew actual people who were hurt during that time. So this is where, is it paternalism? Is it actually a comment on war? We cannot read his brain. Next. Palma, however, saw Santiago's influence through his parishioners, as he highlighted as they would come to New York for a period and return home, carrying with them the seeds of the gospel and becoming almost unconsciously zealous missionaries. He believed this would improve the political fortunes of Cuba and other Spanish-speaking countries, with their Episcopal faith preparing the way for a higher national freedom and a stronger character political character among the Spanish-American republics. Palma later elaborated on this idea, stating that his work amongst Cubans and other Spanish people was a mission to obtain the spiritual emancipation of all American people. In this case, we're talking about all of the Americas. As it is also, and always has been, the center of the political influence that has produced their emancipation from European despotism. By becoming Episcopalian, Palma very much believed that it would enable them to think about political freedom. Yet, this political message was certainly not universally supported, especially as the United States government became less supportive of the revolutionary cause. While many everyday people supported the Cuban cause and pushed for politicians to show their support, Secretary of State Hamilton Fish resisted supporting the revolution. Around the same time that Fish discouraged support for the Cuban cause, especially from the New York-based exiles, Santiago stopped working with English language papers. It was not even consulted when the General Convention of 1871 created a committee to revise the Spanish translation, although it was the only parish using it. I believe that, while it's unclear why, I have some personal suspicions that Fish's position as both Secretary of State and a key Episcopal figure, as he served in the House of Deputies, was placed repeatedly on powerful church committee and and physically attended the 1871 convention may be one possibility. Those political messages, while they did not circulate more publicly, were circulated in pamphlet sermons that were published and sent to the various Cuban exile communities. They actually were often done to raise money for the destitute who had lost everything in the war. The Virginius is the incident that is most famous in the 10 Years' War, where a lot of people came to the United States, where a boat carrying support for the Cuban cause was captured, and 49 of its members were executed, 2 of whom were founding members of the Church of Santiago. So it really highlights the connection between the two. However, by this point, they got out of the game of overt support for the revolution in this regard. While they continued to give oral support, they never did anything like this again. Instead, by being a little quieter on that subject, they were able to then provide more support to other parishes. They provided more support for other communities, not just in Cuba. This is the work that De Palma did explicitly all around. In Caracas, in Florida, in Key West, supporting the Cuban community there. And then 15 of his hymns were published in the Seminary para el uso de la Iglesia Cristiana Episcopal, which was the hymnal of the Reformed Spanish Church. So it demonstrates how much his connections existed. As Palma's comments on this was that the influence of the Church of Santiago reaches all these Spanish countries in America, because in almost all of them, there are some persons who are members of our church or have been present at our services in this country. However, the end of the war meant that very much Santiago's population completely fell apart. And in the theme of lack of support, they were not supported and therefore did not receive the economic benefits that could have continued this work. But as you can see, De Palma himself reported about where his congregants ended up. In Europe, in Cuba, in Mexico, in Venezuela, the Dominican Republic, Cuba, Jamaica, they ended up in so many places. And ultimately, those people, the exposure that they experienced at Santiago, and oftentimes laid the foundation of their understanding of the Episcopal Church. It lived along for about 9 more years under a man by the name of Zacharias Valls-Denosa, and they worked at Calvary. They were at Calvary Church, and they had also been in Annunciation. That was why the Church of Annunciation was there before. However, it was not funded, and they kept saying, there are 10,000 people we want to reach. Please give us some money, and nobody ever did. So Valls-Denosa took a job in Maryland, and the congregation died. So its legacy is this very small history, but over its 27-year history, the Church of Santiago was able, the Iglesia de Santiago was able to publicize, to publicize Spanish Anglicanism, to make connections, and to basically open a door that would then be continued on by many others.